Welcome to another episode of So in the Know, your go-to podcast for all things shared ownership. I'm your host, Sarah Ellis, Head of After Sales at So Resi, and in today's episode, we're diving deep into the world of staircasing. We're going to be discovering how shared owners can achieve full ownership through buying more shares. Now, shared ownership has become increasingly popular with individuals who want to get their foot onto the property ladder, and it provides a very flexible pathway to home ownership. So if you want to buy but you can't afford to buy on the open market, shared ownership could be a great option for you. But what exactly is shared ownership, and how can shared owners achieve full ownership through staircasing? We'll be explaining all in this podcast. Now, whether you are a current shared owner looking to take that next step to full ownership, or you're simply curious about the process, you're not going to want to miss this episode. So sit back, relax, grab a cuppa, let's get so in the know of staircasing. Now, I'm thrilled to have a very special guest joining me today. Now, my guest today brings a wealth of expertise and insights into our discussions on shared ownership and staircasing. Joining me today is none other than Charlotte Duck. Welcome, Charlotte. And thank you so much for joining us today. Now, Charlotte is known for her reporting and insights into the housing market. And Charlotte has actually developed quite a name for herself in financial journalism for the Evening Standard. And Charlotte has a very keen eye for upcoming trends, insights, and also demystifying very complex topics such as staircasing. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick overview of what shared ownership is. So for the listeners, shared ownership is when you buy a share in a home and you pay rent on the share that you don't own. Now, over time, you can buy more shares, driving you closer to full ownership. That process is called staircasing, and that's what we're going to be diving into today. So Charlotte, once again, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, in preparation for today, I have read a lot of your articles that you've written for the Evening Standard. But what is it that's drawn you to journalism and specifically the financial sector?
So I came to journalism through, I have a very strange CV in that I worked in magazines for several years. I then went freelance, and I've always been really interested in property. I've bored my friends stupid with like the drier aspects of it at dinner parties. And I thought, I'm going to start pitching some ideas. I've got some really good ideas about this. And so it just went from there. And I'm really, I love hearing why people buy the houses that they do and how they manage to get deposits together. I think it's such an interesting subject. And so I guess it's like the human aspect of that is really interesting to me.
Yeah, and obviously shared ownership does seem to be becoming more mainstream. I don't know if you found that, but what's your view on that?
Well, I think it's just because it's now getting so difficult to buy on the open market, especially in London. I think you've got sort of three different factors. You've got rents are getting more expensive, and so you're paying out more money. You can't save as much. House prices are going up, so what you have got saved isn't going as far. And also mortgage lenders are their affordability criteria is tightening with rates going up, so it is harder to get a mortgage.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think the main appeal as well is you get a mortgage on the share. So you only have to get a deposit on the share of the property that you're buying. So I've touched upon it before, but the length of time it takes you to save for a deposit can be the difference of buying sort of within the next, 1 or 2 years to 5 or 6. In one of the first podcasts that we did on first time buying, we talked a bit about the Martin Lewis website. I'm sure as a financial journalist, you're so familiar with that. Yeah. Have you met him?
I haven't actually, but I love his.
One to try and get in. I'm trying to get him on this podcast as well. So maybe Charlotte, you could line it up for us. But I think the other thing is that it's not just for first-time buyers. I think you've done some interviews with families or couples that have actually dipped their toes into shared ownership. What was their journey like?
So I think it's different. So I spoke to a lady who had a teenage son. She had been saving really hard for several years to buy. She bought a 25% share, and she was really incredible. She was very dedicated to staircasing. So she had like a financial plan. She was budgeting. She was planning to staircase, I think, to 70% next year, and then with an eye to staircasing to 100% later on. So that was her journey. I've spoken to another man who actually bought. He was probably one of the first people to do shared ownership. He bought in 1999 in Woolwich when there was not much there.
Yeah.
And obviously now you've got like the DLR, it's like City Airport, everything's there. And he was retiring, and he'd used a lump sum to sell, to staircase up to 100%, and then he was planning to sell and go and live by the sea, which is lovely.
Oh, I love that.
So, and he'd actually bought because I think a lot of people think with shared ownership, it's just flats. His was a 2-bedroom terrace house. And when he staircased to 100%, he then owned the freehold as well. Yeah. So that was quite an interesting, because it's slightly not what you think of the norm, really, when you think of shared ownership.
Yeah, as I say, it's a really good avenue to full ownership, and that's exactly what we try to promote and help customers to staircase up to 100%. And I love that one of the people that you interviewed actually had that sort of exit plan in place. So they actually planned at the point where they bought it to then buy further shares as time went on.
Yeah, I think that's really important, actually, because I think people do that quite a lot with their deposit. So they have like a standing order that would go out of their, I know I did that when I was saving a deposit, you have a standing order coming out of your current account. But then I think there's the temptation that when you have actually bought, then sort of that's it. But shared ownership gives you like a target, and that, if you keep that standing order going, you will get there. And I know I'm sure you know a lot more about this than me, but with some of the new leases, that it's much easier to staircase and to sort of do that incrementally over time.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that, let's actually talk about the staircasing process. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So some of our leases allow for 1% staircasing. Now, that might not seem like much to staircase by, but when you're doing 1% every year for 15 years, you've got an extra 15%, ownership of your property, and that 15% can make a huge difference when you're talking about equity in a home. And the beauty of these 1% increments is that you don't have to get a RIC survey, and you don't have to have a lawyer. So you just contact the housing association, you get your 1% premium, and you transfer it, giving you that 1% ownership every year. But that's sort of a unique way of doing it, and it is mostly a newer part of the model, but it's something that So Resi actually established many years ago. We initiated the model called SO Plus, and it took off really well, and we have lots of customers that take this up every single year. So we probably see around 200 people staircase by 1% every year, and we're seeing that increasing as this new 1% model has been introduced by Homes England.
That's so interesting, because I think a lot of the reason is like the hassle factor, because I know what I'm like if you don't have to do something, you just don't do it. And especially if you are having to like liaise with solicitors and housing association, it's all paperwork, and no one has time. People are busy, so
and
it's
leases
great.
Can be complicated.
And leases are complicated.
And that's the thing. I think having somebody who can help you, guide you through the process as well, because they've not been written in easy English where you can just pick it up and get a full understanding of your products. But you can contact a housing association. Certainly at So Resi, we've got teams who are trained in lease interpretation, and they are purely there to help you. We have a staircasing team that will guide people through the process. So for staircasing, the standard process, let's have a little look at that. So I know you've done some articles on the process. What's your understanding of how it works and what it could cost?
So I guess you would contact your housing association, let them know that you're interested in staircasing. And then I think from what I've heard, you get sent like a pack, and then you book a RICS surveyor who comes, gives you a value. And then you would fill in the paperwork with the solicitor and pay the extra amount, and then you would own that share. But that's what I understand.
Pretty much it in a nutshell, yeah. So we've actually got a website where customers, if they want to, we know that not everybody likes to use tech nowadays, but if you want to, you can initiate the process through the website, sharedownership.co.uk. You can register for an account, and you can actually choose whether you're going to go through the standard staircasing process or the 1% process if your lease allows. So you can start staircasing from anywhere from sort of 5% onwards. But you contact the teams. They'll, as you said, send out the inquiry pack. You then go and get a RICS surveyor out to value the property. You'll then get your share calculated, so you know exactly how much it's going to cost to buy that bigger share. And I guess it's how you finance it then, whether you're doing it from savings and, you know, sometimes it's inheritance, or sometimes you're remortgaging. And I think that's the key point where people sometimes forget about staircasing, is that most people will remortgage once their fixed term is up to go on to that better rate. That's the key point, to talk to your financial advisor about buying more shares, because you would have been paying off your repayment mortgage for a certain amount of time. And obviously your rent is going to go down, which is another benefit. So it's always worth looking at what it could cost. But once you know exactly how much that share is worth and you've figured out how to finance it, you get your lawyer instructed. We then help and guide you through the process, or whichever housing association that person might be with, and they help that person get through to completion. So in terms of the pros and cons, Charlotte, what have you found from your investigations?
So I think of the pros, like the biggest pro, I think, is obviously that your rent goes down, which is massive.
Yeah.
And then also, if you look at it as a way to getting to 100%, when you do get to 100%, you know, you're not paying rent, you own the property, you can sell it then on the open market. You can use a non-shared ownership mortgage if you need to. And so there's loads of pros. The cons, I guess, also, if your house goes up in value, you obviously own 100% share and you will get more of a benefit. The cons, I guess, are it does cost money. Also, you know, if the house does go down in value, then you would take a hit on that with a bigger share. But, you know, I think it is a great way to move towards 100%. And I think it is really important to just have that in your eye, you know, in your eye line and as a target, and really work towards that if you are doing shared ownership. Because, you know, I think that's what, you know, housing associations want people to get to 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what we're here for. We certainly want to. I mean, we get absolutely delighted when we see customers achieve full ownership through shared ownership. And I guess there are two ways that you can do that. You can either staircase to 100%, or where you might have made some money if prices, as you say, are on the increase in your area, the equity that you then get a return on of your property can then go down on a deposit on another home, and that could be on the open market. So there's two very different avenues that can help people achieve full ownership. But I guess the other pros to consider for staircasing is obviously there's more flexibility. Once you get to 100%, as you say, there are far more mortgage options out there. Shared ownership at the moment, there are around 30 mortgage providers. And in the big pool of mortgage lenders, that's sort of a pin drop in the ocean, because on the open market, there are hundreds of lenders. Although I have heard there are actually more that are going to be coming onto shared ownership because it is becoming more mainstream. I think a lot of lenders are quite keen to open their doors to to shared ownership as well, which is great. But when you achieve 100%, there's far more flexibility as well. So if you do want to make some structural improvements on your home, if you want to get a loft conversion, stick an extension on the back, I mean, you can do that with shared ownership, but you do have to get approval from the housing association. But the other thing to bear in mind, if you're going to be forking out a lot of money on structural improvements and you haven't staircased or you don't intend to staircase, you still only own a share of that property. So that is something for people to consider when they then go to sell. I guess the negatives then, what would you say are the biggest negatives that you found?
Yeah, I think, well, when I've spoken to people about it, I think, you know, you can potentially end up paying 4 different people and having to deal with 4 different people. So, you know, there's the solicitor, there's the housing association. Sometimes you have to pay stamp duty when you staircase. And then there's the valuation fee as well for the RIC surveyor. So I guess one of the problems is that you're paying out quite a bit of money and you want to do it when you are at you don't want to do it too often. So you basically want to wait until you can staircase by as much as possible. So I suspect that people just tend to just wait and wait and wait. And that's why this new model is so great, because you don't have that. You're like 1% a year. Yeah, you know, for 15 years, and exactly, you've got 15%.
Exactly. And that's obviously if you're intending on staying in your home for 15 years. I think there is always that mindset of, well, what are house prices doing in our area? I mean, you've done some reports on sort of the rise and the fall of various house prices. So what areas are there to sort of look out for with the upcoming trends?
So I from the reading I've done, I would say house prices are obviously going down at the moment, and I think they will probably bottom out around the summer. I think then they'll be either stagnate or go up slowly till about 2025, the end of 2025, and I think they will then start to go up quite significantly. So, I mean, if you are going to staircase, now is a good time because we are in a bit of a trough. And it will be cheaper. If you leave it a couple of years, it is going to be a bit more expensive.
Yeah, I think that's the key. I think when you're noticing that prices are coming down in the area, your initial thought is to panic. But if you're not intending on moving, actually, it's a really good time to staircase because you're buying shares at a lower rate. Yeah. And equally, if you can see that house prices are creeping upwards in your area, it's a good time to strike while the iron's hot and staircase. But it's finding that right time. You know, when is the right time?
So I think one thing that's important to highlight is that with COVID, flats in London have been really undervalued.
Okay.
And, you know, they offer, for square footage, they offer very, very good value when compared to houses. And obviously, you know, shared ownership, a lot of the property is flats. So that is something really important to keep in mind. Yeah,
I mean, certainly around London, we have a lot of apartments on our books. Outside sort of the Thames Valley area or sort of, you know, further north, we do have an array of sort of houses, apartments, duplexes. I even had a bungalow that we listed, which we don't tend to get very many of those. So obviously you dip your toes into shared ownership, but are there any updates on what's happening in the private market at the moment? Has this impacted estate agents at all?
Well, I think with house prices, I think London is going to be the sort of come out of this sort of recession first. I think, you know, a lot of people moving back to the city with return to office work. So I think that is something to like look out for. That sort of, you know, London flats are, you know, going to be
one to watch.
Yeah,
hot property. And we've actually just launched a scheme in Zone 1, wow. 9 Elms, a fantastic development, really exciting, really popular as well, and it's in the heart of the capital, which has been a really exciting venture to get involved with.
Right by the river as well. That's
right by the river, exactly. So let's talk about education then. I feel that there is a bit of a gap, which is partly one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast, because there are so many people who enter into shared ownership, but they don't understand that they can staircase and that they can achieve full ownership by going into this route. What have you found in terms of that gap in education?
Yeah, I've definitely found that's the case. I mean, of the people that I've spoken to who do shared ownership, not many of them are sort of considering staircasing. And I think it is just the fact that you get your deposit together, you get in your property and you think, okay, I'm done, that's it, I'm sorted. But, I think staircasing, you should be looking towards doing that. You should, if you can. People's circumstances change. If you get a pay rise or you get a partner or something, that you both could contribute to the mortgage, I think it's definitely something to look into.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think that there's anything that we as an industry could be doing differently to help promote these services?
I think it is just when people are buying, just talking to them, explaining to them, because, the numbers that do staircase are quite low at the moment. And, doing these podcasts is great because, it's just demystifying the whole process, because it can be scary. And, you think a lot of these people are first-time buyers. They haven't dealt with solicitors before. I think if you explain to them, like, okay, you've done really well, you've bought, but you can increase your share, you can increase that equity. Just making sure that they know that, making the process as simple as possible. I think that's really important.
I agree. And in terms of solicitors, are there any tips that you could give to help someone choose which lawyer to appoint?
I think one that's used to dealing with shared ownership leases is quite important because they are unique and not everyone is used to them.
Yeah, we've certainly found that. I mean, we transact on hundreds of properties every year, and it's really important to have a lawyer who fully understands the shared ownership leave, specifically when it comes to staircasing and understanding how to put together a memorandum of staircasing is what it's called when you're buying more shares. So you want to be issued with your memorandum of staircasing. And if lawyers don't understand the nuances around it, then it can take a little bit longer and it can be quite tricky. So it's certainly worth doing your investigations and making sure the lawyer that you appoint is in the know. So just touching upon mortgage interest rates. So I know you've just sort of touched upon it there, but we've also noticed that certainly in January we saw some of the lowest rates that we've seen in a very long time. Given past trends with interest rates, how do you feel that the interest rates levelling out are going to impact the housing market?
So I think obviously they are still high compared to where they were a few years ago. I think there are going to be a lot of people coming off fixed rates, but obviously they aren't like the numbers that we were seeing last year. I think house prices, as I said, will stagnate a bit. But I think generally, this is sort of where the mortgage level is going to be now. This is like the norm, around 4%, be around the norm. So yeah, but it will be interesting to see what happens. It
certainly is. I mean, when you think everything that the economy has gone through, and all of the reports of what's going to be happening in the housing market. We've had Brexit, we've had COVID, we've had sort of an economic crash in the last year. It's certainly going to be interesting to see what the next year holds.
We have a general election as well.
Well, so. Exactly. We've got that to chuck in the mix. But certainly we can see that confidence has resumed in the market, and we're certainly getting a lot busier. And I think the appetite for shared ownership is always going to be there. We talked about it earlier, didn't we, Charlotte, about the culture of buying in the UK compared to other countries. People will still want to own their own home.
Yeah, they really do. It's just, I think it's something inherent in British people.
I think it is. You're right. So from your experience and the articles that you've written on shared owners, is there any limitations or restrictions that you've come across in your reporting?
So I think from what I understand is that you can't always staircase up to 100%. I think sometimes there's a cap of 80%. Is that right?
Sometimes there are certain developments that might have a preserved equity, and that might be where particular local authorities or housing associations always want to retain shared ownership stock. So there will always be some level of affordable housing in particular areas. Now, anyone who's looking to buy a shared ownership home, they will know this before they buy, so it will be, or it certainly should be, noted in the advert.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it will absolutely be noted in the lease, and the solicitors will be able to identify that as well. So people will know before they buy, but it's usually in higher value areas where they're keen to try and retain some level of affordable housing in the area. So we see a few of those, not so many. In fact, I've actually noticed more and more developments with a preserve being lifted so that customers can then achieve full ownership, but certainly worth doing your investigations from the offset to know exactly what type of lease you're buying into.
Yeah, I think that's really important actually, because I think sometimes people do buy and they don't understand their lease, and I think just make sure you ask questions, because your friend might have a shared ownership property with a totally different lease, but you need to know what your one involves and what the restrictions are.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm actually going to shift the focus away a little bit now from shared ownership. Now, you wrote a really interesting article about rental trends and the comparison of rental increases, specifically around London, compared to house prices. Really keen to gauge your thoughts on this article. It was quite an interesting read.
So we found, looking at research, that rents are due to go up 25% before 2026 in London, which is obviously huge. Sort of the result of a lot of landlords are selling up now. Pretty much every landlord I've spoken to is either selling up or reducing the size of their portfolio. Just there's such a lack of supply. So you've got that coupled then with house prices going up by about 11% in the same period. So it is getting tricky because you're paying more of your salary is going towards rent. I think at the moment it's about 42% on average.
Wow.
What Londoners pay towards rent. So it's harder to save. Plus house prices are going up. So what you have got saved doesn't stretch as far. And then because mortgage lenders are sort of getting tighter on their criteria, what you can borrow is also less. So it's sort of a three-pronged attack, which, I think is why shared ownership is a great option, because you are getting that foot on the ladder, you are getting that little bit of equity, and then you can build on that with staircasing if if you're clever and you budget.
Yeah, exactly. It's a foot in the door, as you say, and I guess the options are you either privately rent, you buy on the open market. The other option is, of course, shared ownership. But saving for a deposit is certainly one of the biggest challenges that I've spoken to a lot of applicants that we meet, especially if you are in private rented. And as you say, if we're likely to see those rents increasing over the next couple of years, it's going to be even harder for applicants to save for that deposit. But it'd be interesting to see. There are some new affordable housing products that are going to be coming out. We've got Rent to Buy, some very limited schemes, which actually helps people who are in rented accommodation save for a deposit and buy a home. So there's a few of those schemes cropping up here and there. So you would effectively rent the property at a reduced rent whilst committing to save a particular amount every month. By the end of 5 years, you would have saved enough to actually buy that home, and it converts to shared ownership. So it's a very clever product, and I think it might help specifically those people who are going to be faced with some challenges on increasing rents. Have you come across any Rent to Buy schemes?
A few of them, yes, I have. I have done a few, not in like loads of detail.
No, it's not as mainstream, obviously, as shared ownership, and I don't think there are going to be many of those types of developments around the country. But certainly, shared ownership is key at the moment. Right, so thank you, Charlotte, for joining us on the show today. Now, I always like to end the podcast with something a little bit more light-hearted. So In your career as a journalist, what would you say has been the most memorable article that you've written? Doesn't necessarily have to pertain to finance, but what really stands out for you?
Well, one thing I did, which was amazing, which was in 2012, I think it was. I went to Number 10 and we did a Q&A with David Cameron, who was Prime Minister. And we asked him loads of questions about pensions, the gender pay gap, childcare. So that was really interesting. He gave us a tour of Number 10 afterwards. So, which was incredible. Some amazing pieces of art. Tracy Emin there.
Excellent.
So I would say that was a really great experience. Yeah.
Fabulous. So in your reporting career then, what other celebs have you come across?
So I did used to work in a very different area, and I used to interview film stars. So I've interviewed.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Any big names you can share?
Yeah, Keira Knightley, Sienna Miller.
Wow.
Yeah, Ryan Reynolds. So it feels very strange being on this side of the
yes,
camera.
I bet it does. A last question, just for fun. If you could interview anyone, dead or alive, who would you interview?
Oh, I think I've always been really interested in Queen Elizabeth I. I just think it's amazing to have been like a female leader in that time when it was just very unusual. And I would love to interview her.
I love that. Oh, good bit of history there. I think if I could interview anyone, dead or alive, it would probably be Martin Lewis, because I keep mentioning him on this podcast and I'm keen to get him on the sofa. So Martin Lewis, if you're listening, we'd love to have you on the show. Well, thank you once again, Charlotte. Thank you. You've been a fantastic guest and you've given us some great insights
into
staircasing. Thank you. And thank you to the listeners for tuning in to another episode of So in the Know. Now, there will be more episodes and more experts to come. So please make sure that you follow us or subscribe. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, along with all of the other main streaming websites. So until next time, this is So in the Know. Thank you for listening.